So how do you create an excellent, safe, effective, engaging, smart yoga sequence? Well, in this series of videos, we're going to be talking about some of the skills that you can use as a teacher to gain confidence in the fact that you're creating a sequence that really works and is safe, smart, and effective. So in this video right here, we're just going to lay the groundwork for a couple of terms that you need to know in order to start using the peak pose sequencing style to create your classes. And I love this kind of sequencing style because not only is it super fun and creative, but it's also biomechanically smart for your students. So let's dive in. Okay, first let's talk about what the heck is peak pose sequencing. So you guys, there's tons of different sequencing styles out there. You have like wave flow sequencing, peak pose sequencing, well-rounded classes. There's tons of stuff. But the kind of sequencing that I like to do is something that we call peak pose sequencing, and some of you might be familiar with this already. And the idea behind this kind of sequencing is that we're going to choose one pose, and usually it's a relatively sophisticated pose. It's complex. And by that I mean that it has a few different moving parts that we kind of need to bring together in order to do it effectively. So think about like revolved half moon, which is a complicated standing pose. Think about wheel pose, a really complicated back bend, or Vashisthasana, a side plank with a variation. Those would all be examples of kind of apex poses that are kind of challenging to do. So in the peak pose sequencing style, we start off and we choose one of those, and then we work backwards to figure out how we can work up to that pose safely and effectively. So that's what the peak pose sequencing style is. And what's really nice about this style is that you can do all sorts of, you can add your own flavor to it. For example, if I kind of create a logical sequence, let's say we're going to a peak pose of wheel, I can make that class in the Hatha style, by which I mean a little less flowy, more alignment, maybe a little bit more accessible to a wide range of students. Or I could use that same logic and create a really flowy sequence that repeats poses, uses complicated transitions and sun salutations. But the logic of which poses I'm going to use to get to my peak and how I'm going to prepare for it is the same. So this is a really fun style because you can add your own flair to it pretty easily. So let's talk about kind of like the keystone of peak pose sequencing, which is something called component parts. Now, when I choose my peak pose, whatever it may be, I'm then going to ask myself, what are the component parts of this pose? A component part is a part of the body that needs to be warmed up or educated in order to do the pose effectively. So I'm thinking about like, what are the special needs of this pose? What is challenging about it? What makes it complex? What are the different things that different parts of my body need to be accustomed to do in order to do this pose safely and effectively? So let's look at wheel pose for a moment, because wheel is a big pose, right? It's got lots of stuff going on. So let's look at it. I might think to myself, in wheel pose, what's going on in my pelvis? I might think, what's going on in my shoulders? What's going on in my spine? And I start to break the pose down and look at its requirements. So let's do that together. So for wheel pose, I might look at it and I say, okay, first let's take a look at the thighs and the hips. Well, the thighs are what we might call square, right? I'm not externally rotating the legs. I'm not internally rotating the legs. The legs are neutral relative to the pelvis. So I'm going to think, all right, my hip joint is neutral. That's different than a pose like, say, half moon or pigeon pose, right, where the leg is turning out. So I got to do neutral legs. And then I might think, wow, in this pose, the spine is obviously in extension. I'm doing a big back bend. That's the whole purpose of the pose, right? So I'm thinking, well, another part of the body that I want to warm up is going to be opening the chest, or what I might call thoracic extension. I might also think, you know what? If I think about what's challenging in this pose or the risk factors of this pose. This can be good to think about. What do I want to make sure students are doing to stay safe? For a big back bend like wheel, I'm thinking, wow, even though it's a big back bend, I don't want them to collapse or hyperextend their low back. That tends to be a point that they kind of collapse into. So I'm also going to include core engagement. And by that, I mean, I'm going to figure out how to support the lumbar spine by engaging the front of the body a little bit so we don't go into hyperextension too much. So far we have neutral hips. We have thoracic extension and spinal extension, but so we don't overdo it, we also have core engagement and core awareness. And then I might say, okay, so what's going on in the shoulders? Wow, the arms in wheel, first of all, have to go here, and then they have to straighten. Anatomically, this position is called flexion at the shoulder. That means my arm is going forward way up here. But there's also external rotation. You know how the arms like to fall out in wheel pose? They like to pop out? Well, we need to externally rotate this arm to keep it in. So this is where understanding anatomical terms can be handy, just so that there's an easy language to talk about what the body is doing. So for the shoulder girdle, I have flexion and external rotation at the shoulder. And then I might think, so okay, that's a lot going on. And then I might think, okay, is there anything else that I want to think about? You know, are there any other common risk factors or misalignments? And I might think, oh my gosh, we're on our hands, right? Hands and wrists. So, hey, it might be useful to educate the hands and the wrists because I'm going to have to use them to support my body weight. So maybe we'll do a little, hand work or hand warming up. I might also think, wow, the knees tend to fall out a lot. And this is part of neutral hips. When I'm pushing up, you know how in bridge pose and wheel pose your knees tend to go out? So I might add in, wow, I really want to teach them how to keep their hips square. And this kind of goes with that neutral hip component part. And so by the time I sort of thought about this, I have like a list of like 6 component parts that are important. Oh, one more that I almost forgot. Super important for back bends. Not only are my hips neutral, but I also have to open up my hip flexors. So for most back bends, the front of the thigh, the front of the hip is stretching open a little bit. And this is really important because opening up the front of the hip helps prevent that lumbar hyperextension. So let's just review what we got so far. We have neutral hips, okay? And I might teach people how to hug their thighs together in order to keep that. Open hip flexors. So I want to do poses that stretch the front of the hip, which is going to help me get into that big back bend. I have spinal extension, particularly in the upper back, because that needs it a little bit more. To protect the lower back, I'm going to work on my core. And then finally, I've got my arms in flexion and external rotation. And then maybe I also want to think about the hands and the wrists. So that's the process of thinking of your component parts. So once you pick your big pose, your big ass pose, I want you to write down what are the top 5 to 6 parts of the body that need to be warmed up or educated in order to do the peak pose effectively. Now the next step in creating a really great sequence, and this is what I'll recommend you do, is to brainstorm. So you think, what are more accessible poses that help to warm up that component part? And when you're starting to do this process, I recommend that you take each component part individually. So let's do wheel pose again. All right, so I'm starting off here with, what do we say, neutral hips, right? So that means my thighs are square. I'm not externally rotating one of the legs or internally rotating, but I'm keeping them all lined up, right? Like railroad tracks, and not letting the knees fall out or in. So then you start to think, well, okay, and again, one component part at a time, I think, what are some poses that help me to educate that in my students that are easier than wheel? So where can I do that that's more accessible? And then you make a big list of all the poses that help you educate that in your students' bodies. So I might think like, okay, where else do I have railroad tracks like this? Well, Tadasana, obviously, it's a no-brainer. Chair pose, low lunge, high lunge, warrior one, pyramid pose, warrior three. So I'm thinking all these poses, twists, revolved chair, revolved high lunge. And those are good too because they really ask your body to hug in. So I go through and I make a list of all of these great poses that help me to teach that component part. You might also think of poses where you're seated. I might think like hero's pose or Vajrasana, thunderbolt pose, or eagle pose, Garudasana, which really helps to teach that squeezing in action. You could think about reclined poses even, like Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana maybe, where your leg is up in the air. Or any other pose that really teaches you to squeeze in. I might think about what I call active hip openers. That would be something like Supta, reclined hero's pose, Supta Virasana. And you would just write all of those down, all your big brainstorm, and that's when it gets kind of creative and you get to think about all the different poses that you know. Let's just do one more component part like that. So say I'm thinking about like, okay, well, where do I do thoracic extension? And here's something really cool. Since I know I want to teach spinal extension, but I want to engage the core, you can kind of put those two together and know that when you're teaching your back bends in your sequence, you're going to simultaneously teach your students how to protect their lumbar spine while working to really activate and engage the upper back. So you'd make all a list of the places you can do that. Hey, let's think locust pose, sphinx pose, bow pose, maybe a standing back bend like in high lunge, or maybe just standing back bend in Tadasana. You could think of heart melting pose, Anahatasana. We might think Ustrasana, camel pose. We might think bridge pose. So I'm thinking of all the different places that I can really educate that part of my body. And so you would do that for each component part. So you do that for your neutral hips, you would do that for your back bending, you would do that for your upper arms, and then you might think about hands and wrists. Now hands and wrists, that could also be something where, you're doing cat-cow, and as a teacher, I just remember, I want to teach them. I really want to speak to all four corners of the hand. I just want to make sure that I work some of those cues into the fabric of my class. I may not have to do a specific pose to educate that, but just remember that I want to keep bringing that into my teaching as I go. So the next step of creating a great class like this is then you take all of the poses that you've brainstormed and you look at them. Now, some of the poses, they're going to address more than one component part. So for example, if I do high lunge with my arms up and add a little back bend, hey, I got neutral hips in there. I'm working to stretch the hip flexor of my back leg. I'm working my arms in flexion and external rotation. And I'm also working a back bend through my thoracic spine. Bingo! That addresses a lot of the component parts that we need for wheel. So as you go through, you'll see like, okay, there are poses here that address a lot of the component parts, that just address some, and then you get to start putting them together into your sequence. And as a general rule of thumb, super logical, you guys, you're going to want to order them from the most accessible, kind of the easiest, all the way up to your peak. And the poses that are close to your peak, those should be very similar. They should start being pretty complex. Those are poses that are going to address most of the component parts you're doing. So for example, the pose that we usually do before wheel is bridge, right? Because we're on our backs, we're working neutral midline legs, we're working thoracic extension, we're working a little bit of core engagement. The only thing that you don't have in there is the arm position, right? Which you have for wheel. But bridge is pretty close. And so that would be a pose that we would do pretty close to wheel. And usually we just do it right before, right? But keep in mind, you're still going to want to work those shoulders and lots of poses earlier than that. And so there you have it. That's kind of how the logic goes. And then you stack it up and then practice it yourself and, moderate it for the style you want to create. Like if I'm teaching a Hatha style class, I won't have so many crazy flowy transitions. I might take more time with each pose, so I might do fewer poses in the class. If I'm doing a real flow kind of sequence, I might have lots of vinyasas and start off with sun salutations. But the logic of which poses you may want to include and the order that you choose to do them in, regardless of how you kind of get into them, is going to be the same. And that's going to lead you up to your peak, which will be the most challenging part of your class. The next thing to think about, and this is the last thing we'll think about in this video, but is the integration, or it's the cool down, you might have heard it, or the counter posing. So when you're thinking about your counter poses, you want to consider, what did I really have to work, or what really got opened in that peak pose? And is there a way that I could gently kind of counterpose or oppose that action? So if we've just done a big wheel, big backbendy kind of experience, well, I'm thinking of my spine. My spine's been an extension. I might want to do some flexion. I want to do some forward folds, right? Kind of go there. I have been working the backs of my leg, right? They've been working to lift me up, my hamstrings and my glutes. So I might say, I want to stretch out the backs of my legs. I'll stretch them out into a forward fold. You might think, wow, I really had to hug my legs in a lot. That really worked the inner thighs. So I might do something that stretches the inner thighs, like Baddha Konasana, cobbler's pose, or a wide-legged forward fold that's more cooling. And of course, we want to choose poses that help to calm the body down. So the body's been kind of active, woo! And now we want to think about preparing for Shavasana. So mostly we're going to do seated poses, reclined poses, things that help us move into a state of relaxation. But we're thinking about like, wow, what did I really work or stretch open? Let me just see if I can give the body a little bit of the opposite, a little bit of antidote to bring us back into balance. So there you have it, everybody. Here is sequencing 101 in the peak pose sequencing style. So in this video, we talked about, hey, what is peak pose sequencing? What are component parts? And then we looked at how we might use those particular concepts to create a safe and effective logical class up to a peak pose. So I hope you have enjoyed this. Please subscribe for more tips. If you have thoughts or questions, put them in the comments below, and I will see you on the